All right, so today we're diving into a topic that you might think you know, but trust me, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. We're going to be talking about the Allied Alliance during World War II.
Right, because everyone thinks it's just the good guys versus the bad guys, black and white, right?
Exactly. And we're going to complicate that picture a little bit today. We're working with excerpts that you sent us from, believe it or not, Wikipedia.
Yeah.
The article is Allies of World War II.
Yeah.
And I have to say, just digging into this, like, even sources that you think are going to be kind of basic, there's so much more there.
Always.
So whether you are like prepping for, a history debate or you just, love a good aha moment, this deep dive is for you.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what we find when we kind of dig a little deeper into this is, like you said, it's not as black and white as you might think. It's a really complex set of, motivations and shifting allegiances. And it's just a fascinating story that kind of challenges our, I think, like you said, our initial assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that jumps out immediately is just the scale of this alliance. Like we always hear about the big three, right?
Right.
US, the UK, USSR. But the reality is the Allied camp was incredibly diverse.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It was a global effort. Like you said, you have that initial core, right?
Yep.
UK, France, Poland, which kind of, is almost like World War I all over again.
Hmm.
But as the Axis powers start kind of pushing outward, you have this ripple effect, right? You have countries like, we were talking about this before the show, Brazil sending troops to Europe, Ethiopia rejoining the fight after being invaded by Italy.
Wow.
It's just this kind of reminder that this is a conflict that really had tendrils reaching far beyond just the European continent.
Okay, so let's talk about Brazil for a second, because I got to admit, like that one threw me for a loop when I saw it in the materials you sent. They actually considered siding with the Axis.
I know, right?
That just seems wild.
It's so interesting. And it's a fascinating case study, I think, in how national self-interest often kind of trunks ideology, right? Because, you see, at the time, Brazil was actually governed by a regime that a lot of people considered to be, get this, quasi-fascist.
Wait, hold on. Quasi-fascist.
Yeah.
That's a new one for me. Can you unpack that a little? What does that even mean?
Yeah, so basically what it means is they had a government that shared some characteristics with fascism, right?
Right.
So things like authoritarianism, nationalism, a disdain for liberal democracy. But it wasn't a mirror image of, Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy, right? They were their own kind of unique blend of authoritarianism, you know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
So like they were kind of in the neighborhood, but not like fully committed.
Exactly. It's like they were flirting with the idea, but they weren't ready to like fully commit.
Okay, so what was the turning point for them? Like what shifted? Because they obviously didn't end up joining forces with the Axis. So what happened?
Well, I think pragmatism played a huge role here. So the U.S., recognizing the strategic importance of Brazil's geographic position, they're a big country in South America, exerted significant economic pressure, right?
Mm.
And then, of course, there was the issue of German U-boats attacking Brazilian ships in the Atlantic.
Oh, talk about adding insult to injury.
Right. Like suddenly it's not just an ideological debate anymore. It's like, hey, our ships are getting sunk.
Right. Things just got real.
Exactly. So aligning with the Allies, however uneasy that alliance might have been, suddenly becomes the most logical and, frankly, beneficial course of action for them.
Yeah.
It's just such a perfect illustration, I think, of how even countries with ideological leanings in one direction can be swayed by real-world events and strategic calculations. And this is probably something that resonates with you. I know you're interested in kind of geopolitics today and how these things play out.
100%. And it's interesting to think about, right? Like you've got this war happening on another continent. It almost feels like distant, right?
Yeah.
But then suddenly you've got U-boats taking down your ships and it's like, oh, okay, I guess we're involved now. It really underscores how interconnected the world was becoming, even back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it shows how events in one part of the globe can have these really unexpected ripple effects elsewhere. It's kind of a timeless lesson when you think about it.
Totally. And speaking of unexpected ripple effects, I think we've got to talk about the big three. Even with a common enemy, I can only imagine how tricky it must have been to navigate those relationships. We've got the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, all with their own agendas and ideologies.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes it so interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
you've got the U.S. and the U.K., both democracies, sure, but even they didn't always see eye to eye. And then you bring in the Soviet Union under Stalin, a communist state with a completely different worldview and a healthy dose of suspicion towards the West. It's no wonder there were some fireworks behind the scenes.
It's almost like You know when you're trying to fit those puzzle pieces together and they're kind of the right shape, but not quite? That's what I'm picturing here.
Yeah, yeah.
On the one hand, you've got the US and the UK democracies, shared history, even if their styles were different. But then you bring Stalin and the Soviet Union into the mix. Communism, totally different outlook, and let's be real, a whole lot of distrust towards the West. No wonder things got a little clashy.
Oh, absolutely. And to really understand those clashes, we have to bring in this concept that was floating around at the time, the four policemen.
Oh, yeah, I was just getting to that. It was Roosevelt's idea, right? Like the US, UK, USSR, and China, they come out of the war as these major powers, and they're responsible for keeping the peace. Almost like a superhero team, from what I was reading. Did the big three actually buy into that?
Well, four policemen was always more of a Roosevelt thing. Churchill, for example, wary. He did not love the idea of the Soviet Union having too much influence, especially in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And Stalin, ever the pragmatist, he was more focused on securing Soviet borders, building up his own sphere of influence. But still, just that whole concept, these powers as the ones calling the shots, it really shows you the power dynamics at play.
Totally. It's like they knew the world was being reshaped and they were going to be the ones holding the chisel, right?
Yeah.
But with all this tension simmering underneath, how did they manage to function as a team, at
Right.
least long enough to win the war?
It was a balancing act, that's for sure. They had to compartmentalize to a certain extent. Were there massive ideological differences? Yes.
Hmm.
Suspicions about what would happen after the war? Absolutely. But there was also that very real, very immediate threat,
Hmm.
the Axis powers.
So it's that classic enemy of my enemy situation.
Exactly. But, and this is important, that doesn't mean the tension was consequence-free. Take the delay in opening a second front in Europe, for example. Huge point of contention. Stalin saw the West dragging their feet, and to him, that looked like a deliberate move. Let the Soviets take the brunt of the fight against Germany, weaken them in the process.
Wow. So they're fighting side by side, but in the back of their minds, mistrust.
Exactly. And that, right
Well,
there, that's what's so revealing about alliances in general. Even when there's a common enemy, it doesn't erase those underlying tensions.
it's like they're holding this alliance together with one hand while the other hand's getting ready to, throw down.
And as the war went on, those cracks, they just became impossible to ignore.
It's wild to think that even with all that going on, Roosevelt was still pushing for the four policemen idea. It's almost like he was so determined to find a way, despite all that mistrust, to build a more stable world after the war.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Roosevelt was, in a lot of ways, a real optimist. He really believed that they could, even with their differences, find a way to share that responsibility, that global security burden. And you could argue that the UN, right after the war, kind of reflects that hope.
Oh, totally. It's like that superhero team thing he imagined. It kind of actually happened, at least on paper, right?
Mhm.
But you mentioned the Cold War earlier, and, well, that doesn't exactly scream global harmony. So what happened? Did that four policemen vision just fall apart?
It's almost like a textbook case of unintended consequences. You see, even while they were fighting the Axis, the seeds of the Cold War were already there, right beneath the surface. So you have the UN, created for lasting peace, and it almost immediately becomes this whole other battleground. But
Mhm.
this time, it's the US and the Soviet Union fighting their ideological rivalry out on the world stage. Shows you how even the best intentions can get swept up in these larger historical currents.
So the alliance that saved the world couldn't survive the peace that came after.
Pretty much sums it up, yeah. That shared enemy, that was the glue holding it all together. Once that was gone, the ideological cracks were just too big to ignore. And it's fascinating, I think, the UN Security Council. Most people see it as this legacy of the Allied victory, right? But it still reflects those power dynamics, even today.
Totally. It's still the US, the UK, Russia, obviously. The USSR is gone, now France, China. All those permanent seats, straight out of their roles in World War II. It's amazing how these echoes of the past just keep reverberating, even in something as, formal and structured as the UN.
It's really remarkable when you think about it, and it just goes to show history. It's
Mhm.
not just dates and names in a textbook. It has this way of shaping our world in ways we don't even realize, even today.
Absolutely. And that's something for everyone listening to ponder, really. If those powerful alliances can shift so quickly, even after a shared victory, what lessons can we learn from them? How can understanding those dynamics help us, navigate this crazy world we live in today? It's a question worth thinking about, that's for sure.